Greetings, everyone. My name is Rebecca Geschwind, and on behalf of Collins Group, I'd like to welcome you to Social Investors versus Donors, a distinction that matters. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to Collins Group webinars. To ensure you have the best webinar experience possible, please follow these tips. Close any other programs that are running on your computer. Call in using a telephone instead of your computer speakers. Move your cell phone away from your computer, and if you experience any visual issues, you can send a chat to Collins Group. You may also contact GoToWebinar at 1-800-263-6317. Finally, today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you will earn 1 continuing education credit for your participation, which is good for certification with CFRE International. Tomorrow, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar that will include the web address to download your certificate, the PDF of the presentation, and access to the recording. And now I would like to hand it over to Andi.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of you who are joining us this morning. I am Andi Price, and I am an associate consultant here at Collins Group. Today, I'm here with Vice President of Collins Group, James Plourde. And we're also excited to welcome 2 guest speakers who will be talking with us today. Our first speaker is Larry Ettner. He is a former business executive with a doctorate in management who now lends his professional and academic expertise to nonprofit organizations around the world. Larry is the current board chair for Mercy Corps Northwest and the professor of management practice at Willamette University's Atkinson Graduate School of Management. We're also joined today by John Bianchi. John is a consultant with over a decade of experience working with nonprofit organizations to show and prove that they're achieving their mission through the use of data. So we're really excited to have these panelists here with us today to talk about this new concept in philanthropy, this new trend that's more investment-minded. So over the next hour, we're going to be talking about our research and our personal experiences with this growing trend. We'll start with some key terms and definitions, and then we'll look more closely at who these philanthropists are. And then we're going to discuss how you can actually engage with them, what tools and strategies you can use today. And then we'll talk about building those long-term relationships and stewarding those relationships. And then we're going to end today by giving you a basic plan on how to get started using these tips and the lessons you've learned today in your organization. So first, I'm going to start with just some key terms and definitions we'll be using today, and I want to start by saying that this is a really new area of research in terms of this more business-minded type of philanthropy. So the terms that we're using are not fully defined today. There's a lot of ambiguity about what's the best definition to use. So we're going to go through the terms that we'll be using today and how we'll be discussing it, but just know that there's a lot going on in this space, and it's still yet to be seen what the actual textbook definitions will be here. So first, we're going to start off with, we all know that a donor is a person or an entity that makes a gift to an organization. And another one that we're all familiar with is an investor, which is a person or an entity that commits capital with the expectation that they'll receive some kind of financial return. And the one that we're using today that there's a little bit of, there's not a clear consensus on yet is social investor. And the way we're using this term is to mean a person or an entity that makes a gift with the expectation that there will be a social return on that investment. And this is a term we're using today, but you might have also heard business-minded donor. You may have heard venture philanthropist. There are a few different terms that people are using, but this is, for the purposes of our presentation, the one we'll be using. And this is in contrast to an impact investor, which is something that we've been hearing a lot about, which is a person or an entity that commits capital with the expectation that they'll receive financial and social returns on that investment. So that's, you might have heard the term double bottom line or triple bottom line in reference to these investors, but we're focusing on social investors today. And we want to look more closely at who these people are, because that will help us understand their behavior and how we can engage them in the work that nonprofits are doing. So at this point, I'm going to just talk very broadly about the general characteristics that we found through our research, and I'm also going to invite our panelists to add any comments that they may have from their own experience. But in general, these social investors are, in our area, very data competent. That's something that is in line with, I think, the culture that we have in this region of being very evidence-based. These are people who are very comfortable with using statistics in their everyday conversations, and they're looking for evidence and facts to make their decisions as they're going through their personal and professional lives. These are also people who have investment experience, whether it's personally just through the investments of their own personal wealth, or professionally they may be people who are in investment banking or a related field. And these are also a group of donors that are likely to be educated at an elite institution. These are institutions like Harvard, Yale, Princeton. There are many schools that fit in this category, so those are just a few examples of the ones that we're thinking of. And I think most importantly here for our purposes is that they likely have a history of charitable giving. These are people who have demonstrated that they are philanthropic. So that's what our research shows us. Do any of our panelists have any comments to add about their experience with social investors?
Andy, this is Larry Etner. And
Hi, Larry.
I guess the impact, or what I would call social investors and impact investors that we have at Mercy Corps Northwest, I guess I would also say are self-made. That the majority that we have expertises in various fields, and they're attracted to the mission that we're providing to underserved communities. But as importantly, they want to lend their financial well-being. They also want to give their knowledge. So we have a very large investor who came from the tech field, and although he gives substantial amounts of money, he wants to be involved in how we do our web design, how we do our interaction of data collection. So he lends both his expertise and his money because those are the impacts he thinks that he can make. So it's kind of what I would call, and then we have another one who provides amount of what I'll call mezzanine funding for various ventures that we offer, and he gets a modest financial return, but also wants to be involved in how we go about selecting the investments and things of that sort. So I think there is an intersection of self-made and dual purpose of both impact investor and social investor, at least in our experience.
Thank you, Larry. I think that's important to keep in mind, that these people are really your partners, not necessarily just people that you go to and have a transactional relationship with. And I think that's an important characteristic as well. Thank you.
Yeah, this is John. I think Larry's spot on. I think that there's two components to that. There's the motivation and the capacity of that social investor, and the capacity being that they are smart, they've been to elite institutions, they're self-made, and they have something to give in their gifts, and their being data competent is a major part of that. And the motivation is the second half of that. So they have a capacity to give. They want to contribute what they've got, which is both financial and programmatic expertise. And what do they want to do? They are a social investor because they want to see some kind of positive change and be associated with that change.
Great input. Thank you to you both. So I think another thing that we want to focus on here is not just the characteristics, but the actual behaviors that we see exhibited by these social investors. And I think a lot of that goes back to what Larry and John were both just saying. Because these people have investment experience or exposure to the investment industry, they tend to be people who make very strategic financial decisions. These are well thought out financial contributions to nonprofit organizations that are made at a time and in a way that makes sense for both them and the nonprofit. And in addition, just like John just said, as a result of their educational experience, not only are these people smart and highly capable, but they're also part of a large social and professional network. Think of all of the people that you know of who have gone to Harvard, Princeton, Yale. Stanford. There are a lot of very prestigious alumni circles that they're in touch with. And in addition to that, and again, I think one of the more important characteristics that goes back to the motivation is because these are people who have shown that they're charitable, it shows that they are interested in being part of broader social change, and they understand that philanthropy plays a vital role in actually achieving that change. They understand the value of the donated dollar, and they are bought into the idea of being charitable. And that's an important characteristic of this group as well. Larry, as someone who has been an executive, you've been in the private sector, and you're now working with nonprofits, and you're also a donor yourself, do you have anything to add about how these characteristics influence giving behavior among this group of donors?
I guess before what impact investors or social investors became in vogue, I followed a path of what are my when I just channeled my resources from my previous private business experience, and then became an academic, and now contribute in the not-for-profit area. I made a conscious decision a long time ago to say, I have X amount of resources to provide, both human capital and financial capital. Secondly, I have areas of interest that I think drive me to be passionate about certain things. And so I started early on in my career when I decided on our philanthropic giving or involvement was basically to pick what I thought were the most important things to my heart that I thought were necessary for certain societal changes. And so that passion is critical. And then figuring out the resource allocation. So, for example, even at Mercy Corps Northwest, my monies go to Mercy Corps Northwest in designated fashions. And I know all of the arguments that you want, contributions that are unhinged in terms of being obligated to something. But from my standpoint, I want to see, for example, the change in terms of our community investment trust. I want to see our micro lending. I want to see our women's prison. So I look at those areas and that are critical to me, and I say, yeah, this is where I want to go in terms of my resources. And secondly, then I can measure the outcomes. And those outcomes are important to me because coming from the investment world, as I did, I measured everything in a certain level of return. I still have that same mindset, and I expect there shouldn't be a level of return, maybe computed differently, but there is a level of return that can be presented and reinforce the impact that the dollars that I give are making.
Hey Larry, this is James here in Seattle. I just want to highlight one thing you said, which I think is really important, and that is you mentioned, you lead with your heart, and I think that when we talk about social investing and data-driven outcomes and et cetera, it can tend to have a very cold, clinical, surgical feel to it, and that these are donors that are just, looking at reams of numbers and data and output. And while that data and output is critical to showing impact, I really still, you're leading with your heart. You're going with an area that you feel passionate about, and that an organization that has sort of captured that passion. And I just think that as we go through in this conversation, it's important that we note that. So thanks for bringing that out.
Great, thank you.
And thank you both for that great transition to our next slide, because before I pass it off to James so that he can talk to you more about why we need this information about these donors and what you can do to really engage them, I want to summarize why we think this group is so important, why they matter to you as someone who works in a nonprofit. And really what it comes down to is exactly what Larry and James were just saying. These are people that, beyond just the capacity to make a gift to an organization, they have the propensity, they have this intrinsic drive and this desire to do good in the world, and to do good in the most impactful way that they can. They want to make sure that they're maximizing their contributions. So that's why they're looking at that data. And they want to make sure that what they're doing is transformational. That's the part of this that really drives these people, just like a lot of the donors we work with. And I think that's an important characteristic, and James is going to touch on that and explore that idea more. And the other piece of this puzzle that we want to highlight that we found through our research is that these are people that are connected to a tight-knit and influential peer group. So think of these people who have these robust professional and personal networks. They're going to have a lot of like-minded peers who are likely also looking for opportunities to make transformational contributions, both financial and in terms of their skills that they can offer. And so these are people that it's important to understand who they are on an individual level and build those long-term relationships, because you're then opening the door to find ways for their friends and family and their contacts to be more involved in the nonprofit sector, educate them and bring them into the work that you're doing. So those are the two big points. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to James, who's going to talk to you more about how you get these people engaged in the work you're doing.
Thanks, Andy. What I really want to focus on at this transition is what I call the case for transformational giving. I think that I've been working in the nonprofit industry for 30 years, the last 5 as a consultant. And I think that the one place where nonprofits tend to fall down in this era of wanting to seek a transformational gift is, my question is, well, do you have a transformational case? Because if somebody is going to give you a gift or is considering giving you a gift that is truly going to transform the work that you do in the community, then you better have a case or a program or an avenue to show how you can effectively use that gift, not to move your organization forward, but to move the community forward. So one of the things that I'm invoking is the 10 times rule. So do you sit back and think of what is the largest gift that your organization has received, and multiply that by 10? To me, that's a rubric for what would be a transformational gift in your organization. And imagine someone coming into your door, through your door, and saying, I want to give you, I'm considering investing in your organization to the tune of 10 times whatever your largest gift in the past has been. What can you do with that level of money? Do you have a response? Do you have a well thought out response for how you would use a gift of that magnitude? Another way to look at it is to look at the impact your organization is having in the community. What would 10 times that impact look like? And I'm using 10, it could be 5, it could be 100. But getting you to think really large and aspirational and reaching beyond what you're doing currently. I find that the elements of a transformational case and what donors, in my experience, have wanted to hear, they want to hear you talk about how you're transforming society, not how you're transforming your organization. As nonprofits, my position is that every nonprofit has the same mission statement at its core, and that mission is to make the world a better place. Now, how you do that, of course, is going to be different from every other nonprofit in the area. But how are you making the world a better place specifically? And do you have the skills and expertise to realize that vision? Do you need to bring in partners? What is the best way to realize that vision? And lastly, are you engaged in visionary thinking? Do you sit with your program staff and ask them to think about these large questions of what would really make a transformational change in the particular sphere that you're working in? So I really think it's important that we do some thinking about this case, because I can assure you that if you're going to be seeking gifts from what we're calling our social investors, that these are the kinds of questions that are likely to be asked of you, so that you need to be prepared. So I want to give you a little bit of a thought of what an arc of a transformational case would be, and really it's very simple. You know, a transformational case would be for you to look at your area, your industry, if you will, and what was the status of things 10 years ago in terms of, you know, I give some examples. I was at the Association of Healthcare Philanthropy Conference in Chicago this last week, and we had someone talk about this arc in terms of genetic research. And he was talking about 10 years ago that it would take, you know, thousands and thousands of man and woman hours, millions of dollars in order to find genetic codes that now are available basically on a computer program that you can find out in, you know, an hour's worth of time. You know, the amazing transformation that's happened between 10 years ago and now. And then what is the vision for 10 years from now? Where do we want to be in terms of genetic research? And he outlined how this new found knowledge and ability to access knowledge quickly is going to impact the world of genetic disorders as far as treatment goes. A very inspiring message for how things are going to be transformed. And I just, you know, put a few other examples on there regarding it. Could it be prison recidivism, end-of-life care? My wife works in the hospice field, and to hear her talk about how people met the end of their life 10 years ago, where we are now in terms of hospice care and pain management, which is really the key for folks being able to have the end of their life being at home and loved ones, and where that field hopes to be 10 years from now, using things like massage and aromatherapy, which has been shown to have real impacts on pain, but yet allow the patient to live a good quality of life. International relief is one that you know, that Larry's talking about through Mercy Corps. So I just want to turn it over to our guests to see, do you have any other thoughts or examples of this arc of a transformational case and how you might make that in your particular area? Maybe I'll call on you first, Larry, with Mercy Corps.
Yeah. Those that you aren't in tune with what Mercy Corps Northwest does, it's an affiliate of Mercy Corps, the International Relief Agency. We're what would be considered a country within their portfolio, and they have a portfolio of 43 countries throughout the world that they provide a variety of different reliefs. In the Northwest, Mercy Corps Northwest primarily serves underprivileged communities in several areas, and the first area of that would be in we have a strong intersection with the prison population in terms of both reentry work and our life program at Coffee Creek Prison. We do micro lending, we do financial education, and we will roll out a concept called Community Investment Trust in January. And how we look at it is, because of the complexity of the services we provide, we have to measure the different areas in terms of data collection. For example, you know, we may want to measure for a government or a state, federal, local funding source, or we may have to measure for a foundation that provides monies, or we may have to measure differently for private donors and their purposes, or we may have both social and impact investors that we need to measure for. And the latest one, which we get substantial services, is pro bono services. So we get a large amount of professional services from other organizations that do it on a pro bono basis, but they want to see also that their contribution is as important as any of the other four that I've previously discussed. So measuring for us is complex because of the multitude of programs we offer, and at the same time, the variety of donors that provide potentially to the same program, but with different ideas in terms of what they want to see in terms of the measure. So,
Larry, when we were talking earlier, you were mentioning about this measurement, and you talked about different levels of measuring as far as the board, management, and funder. And we'd like you to go through those if you could.
Sure.
So some of the aspects of measuring, say, on the board level.
Well, obviously at the board, I mean, Mercy Corps Northwest, because of its culture, is very data-driven. And I think is driven in terms of its executive leadership, and it's driven in terms of the board. So at the board level, you know, it's a little higher information, but we benchmark whatever programs we have. We benchmark it both in what I'll call qualitative data, which might be an issue, for example, the prisons. You know, how do you measure the prisons? Well, basically, how many people are we impacting, and how many re-enter society, and how many might end up back in prison. So recidivism is a big measure for us. And when you think about that, well, that's great at the board level, but I can assure you that's the most important measure when we get funds from the judicial departments throughout the country, because that's their measure. Mm-hmm. But from our standpoint, we go, okay, from the board level, that's a great measure, but what else are we impacting? Are they getting jobs when they're out of the prison? What kind of opportunities are they getting? Are they starting their own enterprises? So those measures at the board level, just in the prison area, versus, you know, micro lending, et cetera. At the management level, you know, obviously it's more granular as you go into it, because operational decisions are being made to allocate in any sort of not-for-profit environment, at least in ours, is scarce resources. You know, what resources are you allocating to this, and what's the impact that you're getting in terms of, gee, how many people are getting loans in our micro lending, and how many jobs are being created? How are we being paid back? So we program in, for example, a 7% default rate, and historically we've run 2 to 3% default rate. So we wanted the greater efficiency of those dollars is that they're doing a good job in terms of underwriting underserved communities in terms of lending that banks would in fact not lend to. And the funder, I think I've mentioned, which is, as I said, the government will have, depending on the source of the government monies, will have different criteria. We have a number of foundation donors, and they are also donor tracked in terms of what are impacts. For example, we have a number of foundations that are working in our community investment trust that come from the financial business, JP Morgan and others who have given us some seed money, but they want to see kind of the outcomes that we're providing. How many investors are going to be in? What's the scope of those investors? How are underserved communities being served with those investors? Private donors, obviously, they have a measures impact. We have, you know, as I said, we have an impact investor who gave us mezzanine funding for a program, and he gets a modest, he and his family get a modest return, but he wants to sit in on every investment meeting, and he wants to know how those decisions are made, and that's okay with us because his skill and expertise adds to the impact that makes in the long run. And a last one that that isn't outlined here is the pro bono services. As I said, we have a variety of professionals that provide pro bono services. Last year, one of our law firms in pro bono services provided us in excess of $140,000 of free legal service, just for Mercy Corps Northwest, just for us, and on only one program. And so for them to see what we're doing, and we have to be very transparent because they're involved in our critical meetings. They're there to give us solid advice, and they can see the value that we're providing. And if we weren't, those services wouldn't come to us. So I think each of those levels, you have to think strategically, what does that level, what does that donor, in a broader sense, want, and how are you going to be tracking that data? And from our standpoint, you know, we do a lot of surveying of our customers, and I did miss that. The client, we have strong interactions with the client. We survey them consistently in terms of what we're trying to produce in the field. Are we doing it effectively? And we do that in both our lending, especially in our prison reentry work and life work. So those are I think the complications. And I think about firms that we in the university who we've offered consulting services to or partnership services to. I think if I were to list 4 that I think do it really well, that are larger than the Mercy Corps Northwest, because we're a fairly modest-sized organization. I think of Chicago Children's Advocacy Center out of Chicago, which provides services for children that are abused. And they have a very strong tracking program that they use. Friends of the Children, which is in Portland as well as around the country, with their mentor program, they measure, the graduation rates and how many of their children go on and their successes. Social Venture Partners of Portland, in terms of their mentors program, very robust measurements that they use as well. And I think just locally here in Salem, who Andi interned for when she was at the university here, Boys and Girls Club of Salem-Marion County have a very programmatic view of measurement. So those are kind of 4 examples beyond Mercy Corps Northwest that kind of came off the top of my head that I think are exemplified as data-driven, and I think it transcends data-driven to marketing and branding. I think marketing and branding become a key ingredient of this data because it gives you measurement within the community to see the impacts and create a brand around what you impact and why it's important to the community. So those are some initial insights.
Hey Larry, thanks for that. This is James here. I got a question for you. When we look at the measurement of impact, and I want to pull out one of the program areas that you talked about around prison recidivism. I'm sure there are certain measures regarding that are sort of accepted throughout the industry. My question is, do you find that the data that you pull around success or lack of success around those programs is pretty much the same data that you would use to show effectiveness for a government funder, for a private funder, for a foundation? Or do you have to tailor that data based on who the particular funder is?
I think there's just no doubt that tailoring takes place. I mean, I guess I would say at the judicial department's level, obviously it's recidivism, and we measure how many dollars we expend in terms of programmatic costs and what the social infrastructure cost would be per dollar that we invest if the person goes back into prison. So, for example, for every dollar that we spend, $14 is saved if they don't recidivate. But, but we measure the recidivism, let's say the recidivism, and my data may be off a little, that if 19 to 21% of persons that come out of prison go back into prison. Those that go through our reentry program and through our life program is somewhere in the 7 to 8%. Mm-hmm. So that's important, but that's also important when you get a foundation that believes in that cause. They want to know that, but they also want to know more of the human aspect. These are families. They have children. These prisoners all have lives that I think impact you when you're there. And we just held a board meeting at the graduation at Coffee Creek Prison about a week and a half ago to hear the stories of our 30 graduates in our life program. And that's where, the judicial department is looking more at a higher level. There's the heart level, which we talked about, that they want to know that story. Our donors want to know. Our foundations want to know those stories. They want to know those stories that those families have been helped, that they're integrating into society, and it's not easy for these those that have been incarcerated.
That's really great. Once again, you're bringing in the heart level, so I appreciate that. In addition to the data that could be needed. So I think from here we're gonna move it on to John. You know, John, you spend a lot of your time dealing with or working with nonprofits around this data management, and if you could share some of your insights around that, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. You know, so much of my time is spent working with nonprofits on what they should track. I'll get into working with an organization, and they'll hand me a report that says, you know, I want to know how many sessions we had with these clients and how many hours we spent with them, and too little on the how did we improve this person's life? And this is the basic outcomes conversation, right? And you know, and I would say most nonprofits are at least having the conversation, but that their systems for capturing the information and reporting don't necessarily add up to getting the right data, finding the right pieces of information. And when we're talking about social investors, I think that's one of the most critical components. One of the things we saw earlier was that a characteristic of a social investor is someone who's data competent. They understand what the data means, and as critical as the anecdotal parts are, the ability to tug at the heartstrings is, you know, a vital part of fundraising, period, and that includes social investors. But for a social investor, you're gonna need to bring them the evidence that your program is having a critical impact. And so and it's more than just, are you tracking the right things? It's, are you tracking it well? So I think for fundraisers, when you're engaging a social investor, it's critical to know what are your indicators. And Larry gave several excellent examples. Recidivism is a critical indicator in any reentry program, any criminal justice. You know, keeping people out of prisons is good for the client, and it's good for society. Every part of it's the critical indicator. Let's keep people out of prisons by helping them improve and stabilize their lives. In other industries, you might see things like, in workforce development is a great example. It's not just, can we help get a person a job? It's, can we help that person keep a job for 6 months or more? And there's indicators out there that say that if you can help a person keep a job for 6 months or more, you have set that person up for dramatic change over the course of their life. So those are the indicators that you're looking for. You need to know when engaging a social investor, because you need to be able to show that to them. This person is going to need to know how is this massive investment going to improve society, and we better come to them with the answer to that question. And it's not that a fundraiser necessarily needs to go out and do the research to find, you know, what is the critical indicator, what is the research-backed indicator from my field, but you better be familiar with it. And the person in your organization who's probably responsible for doing that research, going out and identifying those indicators, is the program side. In an organization that might be getting, you know, $1 million gift or larger, there's probably a program person who knows the answer to that question really well. How do my programs contribute to community impact, to change at the client level and the community level, the important indicators? So engaging those donors with that information at hand is well, for one thing, that's only half the equation, right? So knowing what to track is one major part of it, but then how well do you track it? If this is a person, if your social investor is a person coming from, you know, any kind of business field, they know how data structures and how systems, computer systems, data systems, personnel systems are required to be able to answer those questions. They've got their own systems set up to track things like, are their sales coming in on target? Are they meeting their business objectives? And they recognize the need for that infrastructure in a nonprofit. So it's not only can you convey how you're going to impact the community and the individual, but can you convey to that social investor, and I think Larry was just talking about this really well. He was conveying how Mercy Corps has outstanding systems that track every piece of information that they need to know in order to prove the effectiveness of each program. So it's not just do you know what you need to track, but do you have the capacity to track it well?
Hey, John, I want to ask you a question about that. I was really intrigued by what you said, and when we were preparing for this, your example about a job training program, and that the real measure of impact isn't, how many people enter the job training program or how many people graduate the job training program. It's how many people graduate and find a job for 6 or more months.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very definite rubric, and it's not they graduate and get a job for 3 months or 12 months or 8 months. It's a very definite, marker that has been landed upon. And my question is, widely in the nonprofit sector, you think of, everything from, child neglect and feeding of, et cetera. I can't even think of all the different areas that nonprofits impact. Where would you say we are on having those kind of definable impact measurements that are sort of generally accepted throughout the industry? Are we, in the early stages? Are they fairly well developed? Give me your sense of that, please.
Yeah, I think it's really different by industry. I think the workforce development world, so helping people get and keep jobs, is really well defined because so much money comes from government, and government has successfully implemented programs to ask these questions. When they fund a program, they ask the right questions because it's been developed over time. But other industries, there might be barriers in the way. So, one major barrier for a lot of programs is what happens after my client leaves. I might not serve this client long enough to know whether their life has been positively impacted, and so I can't follow this person forever and identify. This would be, after high school graduation, I help this client graduate. Where do they go after that? Or even earlier in life, if I serve a kid who's kindergarten through 3rd grade, how am I going to track this person to know whether they successfully graduate high school 8, 10 years later? And it's really hard to, depending on the industry that you're in, you might have major barriers in the way of getting you this information, and then it's a matter of partnering with public institutions, public organizations who might have that data, and it can be really hard to do. So we're really in a middle point, I would say. We have come a long ways from where we were 10 years ago. A lot of organizations are tracking the right things alongside tracking the wrong things. But some industries, it's just not, there's big barriers in the way.
And John, the thing about the high school graduation is intriguing because in Tacoma, where I live, there's a group called Graduate Tacoma, and their mission is to improve the high school graduation rate in Tacoma Public Schools, and they're doing an outstanding job. But one of the things they found in their research is that 3rd grade math is an indicator of whether kids are going to graduate high school. For some reason, and the research bears this out, if a kid leaves 3rd grade with a firm grasp of 3rd grade level math skills, he or she has a exponentially higher rate of graduating high school than someone who gets lost in 3rd grade. So hence resources are being put into that particular area to help in that particular place. But I guess I just point that out to say that it's incumbent upon us in the nonprofit to look at and explore research that is going on all around us for us to become more data savvy as to the key markers that would indicate success regardless of whatever sector we're in.
Absolutely, and I don't think as fundraisers that you need to be necessarily the front line of that, but you do need to be aware of it at the very least. I mean, that's what your programs department is for. That's what your COO and director of programs, that's their job to know, to design their program around achieving a particular outcome. But you can certainly help drive that conversation and should be familiar with it.
That's great. I just also want to remind our participants that as we're going to have some time at the end for questions. In your screen, there's a place where you can, in the chat box, type in questions. So if you have anything that's on your mind, be typing them in as we kind of ramp up towards the end of our program. So I just want to, before we talk a little bit about how to get started, just a couple of examples, if you would, of that you've seen of effective measurement? John, you gave a great example on the job training, but anything about, where you've seen effective measurement or data used to share with stakeholders that you could think you could help kind of teach by example? Larry, do you have anything along those lines you could share with us?
Yeah, I guess I'll step away from Mercy Corps Northwest because we do a number of what I call partnerships with not-for-profits and government organizations. We've done about 100 here at the school over the last 10 years. So we do 10 to 12 a year with MBA candidates working. And I think one of the ones that impacted me probably the most was working with Friends of the Children in Portland, as well as they, of course, have a national organization. But, they mentor a person from first grade to the 12th, and they have full-time employees who coach them or are responsible as they advance in their education. So they're the friends, right? Friends of the children. And so that's their friends. And they measure accurately, and they go to a class, and when they select the children, they select the children that are the least likely to succeed. So if we were thinking about in international terms, we call this bottom of the pyramid. That they have the most disadvantaged home life, disadvantaged situation that you can imagine. And they take them and they measure every year kind of their success in terms of it. But at the end, obviously they have a big measure, right? Do they graduate? If they graduate, do they go on to additional schooling? And that as just a single measure of success, they've branded and marketed around it. And they've done a very significant job in terms of policy advancement, in terms of the model that they've designed and on a really simple measure that I think has been implemented. If I looked at Mercy Corps Northwest, we're really inadequate at building the policy case, partly by resources that we're inadequate, and secondly, because of the multitude of programs, we have a hard time branding who we are specifically because we have multitude of, we just don't do education. We just don't do any one singular thing. We have 4 or 5 things we like to do, we think are important within the community, seek resources. So I look at Friends of the Children and see they've got a very significant, robust measure that they can build their brand around and policy advancement, and we at Mercy Corps Northwest are struggling to do that. So it's one does it well, and I think we do it okay, but we have to do it better in terms of those multiple measurements, because we don't have a singular one to say this is what we do. We have multiple programs. So I think they do it phenomenally well. We do it in an adequate way.
Larry, I love that example. Yeah. In fact, that's exactly the organization that I was going to go to. I think that Friends of the Children is an outstanding example of investing the right resources into data so that you can take that data out into the world and go get funding. In the last few months, Friends of the Children, and if you haven't heard the name Friends of the Children, you will continue to. They're growing dramatically. And I believe they started in Portland. They're currently in something like 7 or 8 cities, and I believe they're growing to 3 to 5 more in the next year. And what I think they're an outstanding example of is building a really solid data system to capture exactly what they want to know. And they have monthly, quarterly, annual scorecards, really detailed scorecards with 18 to 20 indicators each. Is the kid succeeding in this? Are they succeeding in that? School, home life, are we contacting them often enough? And they share this at every level, from the director level, CEO level. They provide this information to funders on down to the individual worker. Are you meeting and are your children meeting these indicators? And it's as a result of that, and what appears to be, and this is speculation, what appears to be a direct result of investing the right infrastructure in this program model and the data system around it, that they have immediately gone out and secured dramatic amounts of funding because they can show exactly what they do with every kid that they work with and the success that they're having. Now, I think Larry's absolutely right. They're doing this for one program model, where Larry's working with so many different models at Mercy Corps. You know, to invest that much in each program is not an easy thing to do. But it is an outstanding example of how you can now then take that information right to a social investor and say, this is how we can scale. We can take this exact model, and this is what you're going to see in your community when you do it.
Hey, that's great, guys. Appreciate that. And really, we're 10 minutes to go, so this is where we usually take questions, and we've got a bunch of them. But one of them really points to the second bullet on our slide here, and that is strategies for sharing data with stakeholders. Can you speak to any effective strategies regarding either communication channels? I love the idea of this scorecard, John. Something that everybody can access, but are these more personalized meetings? Give me your sense of what has worked as far as sharing this data, and maybe I'll ask Larry to weigh in on that.
Well, I guess I mean we are data driven, so obviously ours is with our impact investors, social investors. That's personalized meetings to make our case, and the data speaks to the case. Foundations differently, government differently. So I think every situation for us is a little different in terms of who the funding source is and the importance of that funding source. And it may be at a different level because if we're looking for seed money for an idea, so when we went with the Community Investment Trust concept, which we developed and we'll be rolling out, we needed seed funding. And so we needed to go to an investor and say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. We can't show you much yet, but this is our goal, this is our objective. And you have to make as you noted, a very transformational case about why this is important to the community, because you're getting monies that you're not sure you can measure in the immediate term or even the interim term. And I think that's an important item in terms of what monies are you seeking, for what purpose, and the more ambiguity in terms of that, the more difficult the case is. And so if I'm looking for program money for judicial, for the recidivism issue, we have that data. That data is easily computed. But when we started that program, 10 years ago or 8 years ago, we had to convince people that the format and the purpose was right, but we didn't have the data yet to prove it. And now we have the data.
But it's like, as you said, Larry, it's like venture capital. Somebody invests in a business and you're given a plan, you realize that, that business may fail, but you're willing to take the risk going in because you think it's a sound idea. Same thing applies to the nonprofit world. It sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it.
I think sharing data with stakeholders that's a webinar in and of itself, right? But I do want to say that I think that the industry has done a much better job over the past probably 5 years of providing donors in either annual reports or mailers with data analytics in those mailings. And I just see what comes to my house, what we get at our household. Those number pages, those call to me. They don't call to every donor, but they call to me when you show me your numbers. And I certainly dig down and try to find, are you showing me the right numbers? But it's something that definitely speaks to me as a strategy, and I think the industry overall is doing a much better job of it.
Yeah. So, should I turn to the questions? I know we have, yeah. So we've got a number of questions that I'd like to get to. One of them here is the question is how to approach and cultivate these donors, how to find them. And probably the last questions are obvious, but we are a small staff doing all aspects of our work and only peripherally connected to these investor donors, how do you get introduced and not have it be cold calling? I'd like to take a stab at that, first of all. One of the things that obviously I'll state the obvious, your board. How are you involving your board in truly understanding the transformational nature of your mission? How are you leveraging their contacts out in the field or in their daily lives in terms of identifying with donors? And if you don't ask them to do it specifically, my experience is they won't think of it on their own. So really say what you want them to be looking for. The other thing is to use technology ourselves. I use a very simple program on Google called Google Search, and I plug in keywords, and anything that comes across a search engine or stories that have to do with those keywords come across my desk. So, if you're in an area of providing services for families or, abused children or whatever the key words are that indicate your area of expertise, put those in, see what's coming across, see what other agencies are doing, see what other contributions are coming in that are notable is another way to be to find where these donors might be. How about our panelists? Do you have any other thoughts on reaching out and finding these folks in the first place?
I can't say I'm an expert at that, sorry.
I can only give some example. An example is that I've seen several organizations develop, they have their board, we have a board, and then they have what I'll call, and I don't mean this in a derogatory, a youth board, younger than the board members, but trying to draw in a different social connection beyond the board. So Chicago Children's Advocacy Center in Chicago has a very robust board of notables, throughout the Chicago community. But then they were strategic in saying, okay, that's great because we get a lot of money, a lot of contacts, but there's a different level of 25 to 35-year-old professionals out there that we want to attract in our cause. And so what they did was build kind of a two-tiered, one's a governance board and one's also a connection board to attract a broader variety of age and areas of the philanthropy that they can give their time as well as monies. And I thought that was a nice way of broadening the network. Yeah. Substantially with this kind of youth board, and I don't mean it negatively, it's a youth board in terms of it's younger than the typical, at least in our case.
Right. No, that's great. That's also looking at the next generation of philanthropists. So that's great. Well, we're just about out of time. We've got one more slide that we want to share about how to get started, and maybe we'll just close on this. Please continue to send your questions. Andy and I will do our best to answer them or get input from our board members. But first, identify those measures that are meaningful in your sector. It's so important to find, as John was saying, the right outcome measures or the outcome measures that really show the work that you're doing. Next is building a plan to track those outcomes. That's going to be unique to every organization, small organizations versus big organizations. If you're an organization that has multiple service lines, if you will, just try this with one service line. Just build a plan to track those outcomes, manipulate it, hone it, work it, and then and then test that out with your existing donors. Are these outcomes meaningful to them? What isn't, etc. Just start small and doable before you try to take on the whole thing. And then lastly, I really want to encourage everyone to develop your case for transformational giving. One thing that you can do is call your staff together, call your program people together, really ask them to think big. We tend to think incrementally, but every now and then it's just wonderful to sit back and say, what would it be if we got a gift 10 times our largest gift? What could we do with that? How could we transform our community? So with that, we've got 1 minute. So it's 1 minute to thank Larry and John. You two are just leaders in this field, and we were so thankful to have you with us today. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And like I said, continue to submit those any final questions on the control panel, and we'll answer them. And also, especially for Andy and myself, if you would like to send us an email, by all means, please do so. Mm-hmm. So with that, my clock says it's 11 o'clock. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much for joining us.
And have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.